They hunted with silent precision, thrived without supermarkets, and somehow turned acorns, corn, and wild berries into unforgettable meals. These Native American recipes aren't just delicious. They're survival secrets passed down for centuries. Wajapi is a wondrously thick, rich berry sauce and/or pudding that actually comes all the way from Lakota, Dakota, and other tribes of the plains. As tradition would often have it, wajapi would always be made with wild berries that had been slow-cooked to an extremely thick consistency. Occasionally, people would be sweetening it with honey or maple syrup, and even today, it's still something that's considered a fundamental part of Native American dining. It's a dessert, dip, and a topping of its own all in one. The most common kinds of berries Native Americans would use for this were basically just buffalo berries, wild plums, and choke cherries. There were also some versions of the dish that involved June berries, but that was kind of landlocked to the places where June berries would typically grow. Now, it was always something that would be eaten with fry bread or with meat and pemmican. It was kind of like having ice cream after a nice big steak, really. Wajapi was something that was considered a big part of seasonal and ceremonial food, and it was something that was used during lots of gatherings and celebrations. It was something that was considered winter survival food, especially when food would be pretty rare to see. Now, the things you would have it with, on the other hand, like pemmican, they were actually pretty long-tasting foods that were high in energy. They had a lot of rendered fat in them, and sometimes they even had ground berries mixed in. It was something that was widely consumed by the Great Lakes tribes, most notably, especially Lakota, Cree, and Métis. It was really portable, easy to carry, nutritious, and the kind of thing that could give you a real boost of energy before a long trek or hunt. So basically, total survival gear. It's something that's eaten as is, and these small pieces were always chewed on for energy during the hard work of the days. Pemmican could also be turned into soup, in which case it would definitely feed a lot more mouths. Families did that pretty often to avoid people going hungry, since you had to be pretty conservative with how you spent your rations. Three Sisters stew is a really traditional Native American dish that's made mostly from corn, beans, and different kinds of squash. It's called Three Sisters because it involves these three mainstream indigenous crops. They actually made up a significant part of the culture, you know? The stew was something that was common among loads of tribes like the Cherokee and Haudenosaunee. It was made with wild herbs and seasonings too, and some people even threw in venison, rabbit or turkey if they could get their hands on some. Acorn bread was a really nutty bread that was made from loads of ground acorns. Now, I don't know about you, but acorns sound like the next best thing to me when walnuts aren't around. Native American tribes are definitely different because boy did they love their acorns, especially in California and the eastern woodlands. Now, let's give some credit to the crop itself. It's pretty damn adaptable. It grows in most kinds of soil, it's really easy to care for, and is overall low maintenance, so you don't have to worry about messing it up much. Plus, grinding it into flour is a pretty cathartic process for some. I mean, if you've ever crushed together spices, then you probably know what I'm talking about, you know? Acorns were so available that almost every tribe had access to them, and that was largely because Native Americans truly cared for their oak trees, with most tribes adhering to the sentiment. Bison bone broth was something that wasn't just consumed by most Native American tribes, but also something they deeply cherished. See, Native Americans would go around herding their bison and traveling with them, just like family. They would provide sustenance to the community, but the animal was always incredibly well respected and taken care of. It was probably one of the most humane examples of respecting your food. Now, bison bone broth alone wasn't just something that got the people's spirits high because of some mutually shared sentiments. The bone broth itself was extremely delicious, and the bison was tenderized to the point the meat would fall off of the bone. It was honestly quite a sight, you know? It was definitely considered a superfood, and I think it really lived up to that title. Cedar tea, on the other hand, was something that was made entirely from cedar leaves. It was known for its warmth and comfort, something that people really needed back in those times. For indigenous tribes, it had been a symbol of their culture and a key part of it for many, many years. It's a medicinal tea that was brewed because of its healing properties too. There are a decent amount of benefits to having cedar tea. some of which include things like decreasing inflammation, improving digestion, and detoxifying yourself. Besides, it usually just tastes pretty good. Native American tribes across the land would frequently make this tea along with many others, as they kept each other going throughout their nomadic lifestyle. Cedar tea isn't something we see much of today, but that doesn't mean it didn't have its time in the sun before things got changed. Blue corn mush was something that was a staple dish among the Navajo and other various tribes throughout the southwestern lands. The Hopi and Pueblo people were most commonly known for having this. It was actually made from blue cornmeal, mixed with water, then blended with juniper or cedar ash and cooked into a porridge. Blue cornmeal is something that has incredible prestige in Native American culture because it's made from the equally as important crop, blue corn. It's a unique kind of corn because it has a much more concentrated sweetness and nuttiness to it than others too. There's the occasional salt and sweetener as well, but that's really just it. Blue corn mush was considered an essential dish for survival in humid and arid climates. It gave sustenance because it was really easy to prepare, carry, and consume quickly. It also was considered a nutritional powerhouse due to its incredible amount of fiber, protein, and antioxidants. Blue corn mush was something that was considered a ceremonial food, and it was also something a lot of tribes relied on for it being baby food. It had a really mild flavor and it had an incredible amount of digestibility benefits. Plus, the fiber that it had meant that most people would stay full for a lot longer. Wild rice and cranberry pilaf is something that's really inseparable from the Great Lakes and Upper Midwest areas. This is something that is especially very closely linked to the Ojibwe, Chippewa, and Anishinaabe tribes. They had been known for harvesting manoomin, or otherwise known as wild rice, for quite a while. Their techniques and in-depth knowledge of the process had been a treasured community resource for several centuries. Wild rice was something that would always occur naturally since it was an aquatic grain. It would thrive in slow-moving streams and slightly shallow lakes, of which there were many back then. Cranberries were also a very key component because they were one of the few things indigenous to North America and grew in incredible abundance throughout the northeastern stretch of land. The nutritional benefits of mixing both together meant that they had a rice-based dish with a lot of protein, fiber, and an incredible amount of vitamin C and essential minerals. This is really the kind of thing you'd eat to give your body a shot of everything it needs. Tonka bars are a pretty modern interpretation of the original idea for pemmican. They were a traditionally high protein that was made by many tribes that were common throughout the Great Plains. Some of the most notable ones were the Lakota and Blackfoot tribes, for whom pemmican was specifically a survival food they relied on a lot. The dried bison meat, the rendered fat, and the berries would give hunters nourishment that would last several hours or days, and it was incredibly necessary to keep yourself active out in the wilds and woods. The term Tonka actually came from a Lakota phrase, Tatanka. This means great or big, and it is an homage to the relationship of the Lakota peoples and the bison. Tonka bars, which utilized bison meat, were hence very precious items for people who were proud of their indigenous heritage. They were developed by Native American Natural Foods, which is a company that is actively trying to revive indigenous cuisines, culinary practices, and sustainable ways of eating. Hominy stew was an essential dish across so many different Native American tribes that it's a surprise it's still not more well known. It was particularly common among the Southeast tribes, like the Cherokee, Choctaw, and Creek peoples. Hominy was something you could make from dried corn, but it had to go through the process of nixtamalization. It was something that was soaked in an alkaline solution that was typically made from wooden ash and lime water, and it was meant to enhance nutritional value. This was a process that gave you a lot of vitamin B3, which was something that was always in the corn but needed to be drawn out. Hominy-based stews were nostalgic communal meals that would be made in giant pots over large open fires and had all kinds of locally available game meat, vegetables, beans, and more, depending on what was going around in the region. Hominy itself was something that would give you a really nutty and chewy texture, but that worked well with the tenderness of the meat. It was something that was adding a lot of richness to the dish. The nutritional importance of hominy is definitely why it became such a cornerstone of indigenous culinary habits, though. This provided fiber, and most of their foods did because it was really necessary for keeping yourself full longer. Besides keeping their appetite in check, Native Americans also lived a very high-energy lifestyle, for which carbohydrates were irreplaceable. The essential vitamins this gave them also ensured that they would be able to stay protected from local diseases and have a stronger immune system, and since it was eaten so commonly, it became a regular way to upgrade an individual's nutrition within the tribe. Salmon candy was an incredibly unique kind of candy, and I mean that. We barely have anything that's like it in today's modern world, despite our time being dominated by processed sugars and candies. Also known as Indian candy, this was a salmon-oriented dish that would be smoked and sweetened, and the idea to mix both of those techniques together was something that the Tlingit, Haida, and Coast Salish tribes popularized. They were predominantly placed in the Pacific Northwest, and these tribes had relied on salmon for thousands of years. They had their own preservation methods as well, and smoking was one of them. It was meant to help prevent fish from going bad during long and frigid winters. So how do we go from preservation to salmon candy? It's actually a modern adaptable of the traditional smoked salmon dish, just with different kinds of sweeteners that have been incorporated. You have maple syrup, honey, and even brown sugar. At the end, you get a caramelized glaze that gives you the sugar rush you're looking for on top of a decadent, smoky, and slightly chewy salmon. Most tribes would use the salmon that were caught in the Columbia and Yukon rivers, such as Chinook, Sockeye, or Coho. Others would prioritize the kind of smoking wood used, as some believed that there were differences between alder, cedar, and fruit woods in terms of the smoky flavor they would produce. Cholla buds with agave syrup were a desert superfood that originated all the way from the Southwest. This is actually one of the few kinds of cactuses that are edible. They were known as the cholla cactus, and they were a plant that was native to the Mojave and Sonoran deserts. They were edible flower buds, and other southwestern tribes were known for harvesting and eating these buds for centuries. Among the tribes, the most notable ones were the Pima and Tohono O'odham tribes. The cholla buds were traditionally gathered by both during the start of spring, but they had to be carefully picked with sticks or tongs so that the spines of the cactus could be avoided. Next, they had to be roasted and dried, and they had a few flavors to offer, but it was mostly nutty notes and tangy tastes. That did make them versatile, though, especially when they were combined with agave syrup. It was something that was made from the agave plant and was used as a sweetener since way before Europeans ever stepped foot on American soil. This combination of agave syrup and the buds of the cholla cactus created a very earthy dish that had almost everything you needed. It wasn't overly sweet, and the syrup had a pretty low glycemic index, actually. The buds were very high in calcium. They were great for bone health, and one serving of them had more calcium than milk did. So, there's a reason they grew up so strong. Sumac lemonade was something that was known as sumac-ade, but it was actually just a citrus-esque beverage that had an incredible amount of tart to it. It was made from staghorn sumac, which was a plant that produced berries, and smooth sumac. For Native American tribes, these are two instrumental berries due to the way they function as both a nifty food source when fast-acting nutrition is required and a medicinal ingredient. Sumac berries were also something that ripened in the late summer, and they were always steeped deeply in water so that a refreshing, vitamin C-rich drink could be made. Lemons had not been introduced to the North American region yet, so sumac was the next best and closest thing. Still, it had a lot more uses than lemonade ever did. You could use sumac to even flavor different kinds of game and soups, which isn't something you usually hear too much about lemon. Sumac berries were actually harvested when they were deep red, dried, and fresh, and the cold water would help to get the tart flavor out without releasing the tannins that were there inside. The optional sweeteners, such as maple syrup and agave syrup, were really helpful in balancing that tartness out, but most people just had sumac lemonade as it was. They had to be steeped in the water for hours and strained thoroughly, though, which was definitely a lot of work. Buffalo roast with juniper berries is another flavorful Great Plains dish that makes use of every single part of the entire buffalo. The meat was used for food, The hides were skinned, preserved, and used for shelter and different clothing. Utensils and different kidneys of daily tools were made out of the bones, and even the dung was preserved so it could be used later for fuel. That's efficiency, like the textbook definition of it. Slow roasting buffalo meat was something most people associated with Native American culture anyway, but the native seasonings were the real highlight of the show. Juniper berries, in particular, were an extremely key method of preparing different kinds of nourishing meals. Juniper berries were used by so many different kinds of tribes across Northern America and had such a resinous, citrusy flavor to them that they were almost the go-to choice for most dishes. They also worked as a natural preservative, so it felt like they were made to work with savory meat dishes. One of the other reasons why I say that is because of the kind of meats Native American people worked with. Most of them, like buffalo and bison, were deeply rich in their flavor, and juniper berries helped to cut through that and balance out the flavors. The buffalo would be rubbed with those crushed berries, then slowly cooked over an open fire or a pit oven, and it would actually be a beautiful process to observe. Nettle soup is a traditional dish that is actually made from the shoots of stinging nettles. This is a plant that was used by indigenous people across North America for several centuries, but it's also something that you would see in European and Asian traditions. Nettles, among the tribes, were valued for being a food source, but also for their fiber and medicinal benefits. Cherokee, Coast Salish, and Lakota tribes would often gather young nettles in the early spring when they were at the height of their nutritional value. It was something that became edible as soon as winter was over, which made it one of those crops you would want to stack up on immediately as soon as the winter was done. It would help to replenish vitamins, and it was just a very welcome taste, especially after months of eating salted, dried, and cured foods that had been preserved so they would last through the winter. Young stinging nettles would harvest quickly, so people wanted to get them before they did. Why though? Do they become inedible after flowering? Not really. They just develop oxalate crystals made out of calcium, which are just basically these granule-sized bits that aren't too pleasant to chew on. So, sotol roasted roots is a really famous indigenous culinary tradition that merges two ideal ones. Sotol is something that is deeply rooted in the survival foodways of the Southwest, and it is a hardy desert plant that people typically find growing in the Southwest and northern parts of the United States and Mexico. It was used by indigenous tribes such as the Tarahumara and Coahuiltecan tribes, and they had several different kinds of uses for it. As far as desert plants went, it was insanely versatile. You could use it for food, fiber, fermentation, and a lot more. Sotol was something that is best known in today's world as a distilled base for alcoholic drinks, but its underground root crown is what made indigenous people give it the time of day. See, it was incredibly filled with carbohydrates, more than any other desert plant in the surrounding would have any right to be. Sotol's hearts and roots would be roasted in earthen pit ovens so that the fiber structure could break down, turning them into these starchy and sweet sources of food. They had a lot of natural sugar inside them that would get released when they were boiled, so… Hopi Piki bread is also something that's a blue corn delicacy, but this time it's in an entirely new form. This takes the nutty flavors of blue corn that people love so much and turns it into this wafer-thin, decadent blue cornbread that was entirely unique to the Hopi people who had made their homes in northern Arizona. It was considered a ceremonial food, but it also turned into an everyday one. People would make it for coming-of-age parties, birthdays, weddings, special celebrations, and just whenever somebody wanted to throw a feast. What set it apart from other kinds of breads of the time, though, was how thin it was. The cooking process also set it apart, because first, you had to make a batter out of blue corn and ash before you started spreading it on a stone slab that had been greased and warmed up. This made these layers that would be rolled into fragile sheets. But the most attractive part about the process was that the layers were almost entirely translucent. This was a technique that was near and dear to indigenous customs and culture, as it would always be passed down through each succeeding generation. It was a way for them to have cultural continuity. What people would typically do with sunchokes, also known as wild sunflowers or earth apples, would be to mash them, roast them, and dry them. Some of these were done so that they could be preserved and used later on a rainy day, while some were so that they could be used with other kinds of recipes and foods. Sunchokes were cultivated by tribes like the Pawnee, Dakota, Ojibwe, and Iroquois. And unlike potatoes, sunchokes were a staple of the indigenous community a long time before there was anyone else but them roaming the land. They were a big part of how the community got inulin, which was a natural fiber that was really good for digestion. Sunchokes could also be eaten alone and mixed with other kinds of things such as nuts and herbs or corn. Sunchoke mash was something that would be harvested in the fall and winter, and it was one of the few sources of sweetness that people had left to them. The water and broth would be used to make the tubers softer, and the bear fat, or buffalo tallow, was added in to make them overall more rich. The sage, wild garlic, and jumper berries were often the final touch in this dish, giving the mash that herbal aroma it was missing. See, chokecherry patties, on the other hand, were an incredibly important wild fruit that were very commonly consumed by the Cheyenne, Blackfoot, and Arapaho tribes. These astringent berries were always gathered in summer and were usually eaten fresh, with excess hulls being preserved and dried for the winter season. To start the preservation, chokecherry patties would have to be made, which was a technique that pretty much let berries be stored long-term and rehydrated for later use in drinks and stews. Fresh chokecherries were something that people gathered mid to late summer, and maple syrup and honey were popular sweeteners that people used along with the patties to enhance the taste. Chokecherries had to be crushed whole for this, but what was really important was making sure the pits were as finely crushed as they could be. Once they had become fully dried, patties were something that could be stored for months and then rehydrated later on. They were very rich in antioxidants, vitamin C, and were excellent sources of thickening agents for stews and different soups. Once they had become fully dried, patties changed texture. They were actually a bit more rubbery. Still, they are essential survival food because you couldn't find anything that was that high in energy. Smoked eel was something that reflected how resourceful food traditions really were among indigenous people. Eel was something that swam commonly in the rivers of the northeastern United States, and it would be caught in coastal waters most commonly. Funnily enough, people actually used stone fish traps called weirs and spears to catch them. How would they use a spear? Some people thought they would just impale the eels as they swam in shallow waters, and some thought they would wrap bait around them which would lure the eel to the spears. Either way, pretty cool. Kind of like something you'd see out of a Walking Dead skit. Once the massive haul of eels was caught, they would then be smoked for preservation, and this would allow them to be stored for months and carried as a portable source of protein during migratory periods. Even when the tribes were settled or camped out, eels were still a very valuable source of nutrition, especially for waterway tribes. Now, mind you, pine nut soup was something that wouldn't last a day in modern times, but was all the rage back then even outside of the indigenous communities. Pine nuts were considered such a staple food for so many different indigenous tribes, particularly throughout the Southwest and the Great Basin regions. They were tribes like the Apache, Hopi, and Navajo, to name a few. They all relied on pune nuts for two things: their exceptionally buttery and rich taste and their incredible amount of fat content. Pine nuts were traditionally just gathered from the branches of piñón pine trees, and they were always roasted for easy amounts of shelling. Then, they would be ground into a nutrient-dense paste, and one of the most common ways to do that was to consume them in this rich soup that could be eaten alone or mixed with other kinds of dried meats and cornmeal or wild greens. Pine nuts are something that would basically be made in a broth that would be based either around the local game of the day or the vegetables that were available. Then, optional thickeners such as cornmeal and ground mesquite beans were something that were dearly beloved. Wild herbs were something that were considered optional, but most people honestly always added them, at least across the recipes I can find. It was sustainable, long-lasting, and the pine nuts could also last a tribe months if they were kept properly. They were a rich source of protein, magnesium, and vitamin E as well. Bear fat fry bread has a lot of history to it. While it is a technique of making bread that is always associated with Navajo and Lakota tribes, as well as other ones that were living throughout the southwestern areas, Its origins are a matter of debate. The most common belief is that due to the forced relocation of the indigenous people that occurred in the 1800s, tribes were displaced and had to live on reservations. On these reservations, they would typically be given sugar, flour, and bread, which isn't really the sort of thing that they were ever used to eating. To cope with the lack of their conventional diets, tribes started creating fry bread as a way to survive, and that was just frying simple dough in oil so that it would make a crispy and filling bread. Some people see this as a sign of indigenous resilience, but others take it as a bitter reminder of the colonization that occurred. This had led to fry bread being a hotly controversial item in indigenous communities both back then and today. Using bear fat, though, was something that was a lot closer to traditional indigenous cooking than anything else, which was at least one thing everyone could agree on. Fry bread was definitely a lot healthier than processed lard, though, as it had a lot more omega-3s and monounsaturated fats. The next thing we have on our list is a forgotten classic of the indigenous tribes of the Apache and Pueblo tribes. The prickly pear cactus was a plant that they had been making jam out of for centuries, and the bright magenta fruit is actually a really good friend to have in your satchel during hard times and rough environments. The jam was something that would be used to preserve fruit so that it would last throughout the winter months when it would be very hard to find any kind of fresh produce. Most people used prickly pear syrup for medicine, while they used the jam for food. The syrup would help treat burns and inflammation, but you had to harvest the plant really carefully so the tunas, the fruit, would not be damaged. Additionally, while simmering it in water, indigenous people were fond of adding whatever kind of naturally available sweeteners they could find to it. Not only was this a fine source of energy, it was also something that was really helpful in boosting the immunity of children and the ick and elderly. So, corn husk wrapped tamales were something that were a new spin on an old vintage classic, and I really cannot stress the word vintage enough. Actually, it's looking a little weak. Ancient is probably better, because that is how far back tamales go, at least 8,000 entire years. They first originated in the Aztec civilization, did you know? And they also spread across many indigenous nations in the Southwest and Central America. Tamales were dense in nutrition, extremely efficient when it came to transport. They were ideal for long, tenuous journeys that would take a lot of you. Corn was also something that was sacred to Native Americans, and steaming the tamales in corn husks and wrapping it in them for long journeys was a very beloved tradition. The husks had to be folded and tied with fibers, and the tamales would be steamed over hot stones, and this was also done so that moisture would stay trapped inside. Cattail pollen cakes, on the other hand, were a superfood that was forged in the trials and tribulations of the swamp. They were commonly known as the supermarket of the swamp because almost every single square inch of the plant was edible. And not only was it edible, it was dense in just about everything you needed to have a healthy body. Now, normally you associate lethal, pungent, and just outright disgusting or repulsive things with swamps, not, super foods. Collected from the heads of matured cattails in the summer, the pollen was very necessary. It would be taken in woven baskets and bowls back to the encampment. There, people would mix it with water and put honey in there so that a dough could be formed. Additionally, small cakes were then made out of the dough after it was all set and done. These would be shaped by hand, and they would be dried in the sun for preservation. After that, they would be cooked ever so gently on hot stones or in clay pots so that they could be eaten immediately when someone needed it. They were one of the few sources of naturally available B vitamins, and they were also free of gluten but full of antioxidants. This meant that any kind of oxidants that people would pick up naturally just from their day of life could be taken care of before they ever became a problem. Foraged foods didn't need to be farmed, so they were just really sustainable. Pollen cakes were a really important seasonal food because they gave you this sweet flavor, and foragers today still haven't forgotten the importance of them. They continue to collect them and continue to make cakes, porridges, and everything in between out of them. Back in the day, haggis was popular everywhere around the globe, but it's limited to only Scotland now. While haggis might not be everyone's cup of tea, it's definitely a dish worth trying at least once. We're back to the basics with this one as boiled mutton. Who doesn't love some boiled mutton? This dish exists in almost every part of the world, with every culture having its own unique variation. The mutton was often placed in a large pot with root vegetables like carrots, turnips, and potatoes, slow-cooked until the meat fell apart and the vegetables were tender. This dish was the perfect meal to warm your insides on a cold winter day. Boiled mutton emerged as a common meal in medieval Europe, especially for the lower classes where it was cooked only using meat and water. Now, this one is slowly becoming more and more outdated as people usually go for more flavorful meats. But with the sourdough starter is a magical concoction that turns easy ingredients into fluffy, delicious bread. It was a staple in Grandma's pantry long before gluten unfastened was even a factor. This ancient tradition goes back hundreds of years, proving that while the era has advanced, our love for an awesome loaf of bread hasn't changed a chunk. The best part? That sourdough starter can live forever. With a bit of care, it can outlive Grandma herself. Just consider it. A little jar of gooey goodness bubbling away, equipped to convert any dough right into a crusty masterpiece. Sourdough is a real multitasker in the kitchen. You could make the whole lot from classic loaves to pancakes, waffles, or even pizza crust with that starter. And don't even get me started on the flavor. It has a unique tanginess that normal bread just can't compete with. Plus, some say that the wild yeast found in sourdough can be easier on your digestive system. It's like a pleasant little bacteria party to your gut. But be cautious. If you forget about your starter, it will develop into a science experiment gone wrong. No one wants to create a brand new breed of kitchen mold. So, next time you tear right into a warm slice of sourdough, don't forget Grandma's old jar of starter, bubbling away like a wizard's potion, bringing comfort and pleasure with every bite. I'll forgive you for thinking this is another showcase of how we tried to copy other countries' culinary mojo, because Swiss steak does sound pretty well Swiss. What might raise your eyebrow is that this is actually a purely American dish. It involved braising, which is a kind of slow cooking that tenderizes any cut of meat to the maximum, and this one involved a round steak in a tomato-based sauce with bell peppers. It was a pretty big classic in the 30s and 40s. Whenever people could afford to get some cuts of meat, they were usually cheap, and as a result, they were more than likely to be tough ones. A dish like this that could take even rubber disguised as beef and turn it into a buttery, smooth steak was a godsend in those times. The fact that it didn't need a lot of work on the side to make it shine also meant that it was something the populace could really jibe with, and slow cooker meant that you could braise away without worry. It wasn't one of the most popular steaks ever. And of course, if you were working with recipes that were centered around making better cuts of meat shine, you'd probably get a more decent steak experience, but it was a homely meal to have after a tough shift or a day spent taking care of the kids. Can anyone ask for more relief? Especially when cooking, it became a non-issue later on. There are some baking challenges that only your grandmother is equipped for, and making the pinnacle of brown butter sweet potato pies was one of them. Seriously, even bakeries and fancy eateries have struggled to nail every aspect of a pie, but for most home chefs in the United States, it seems to be just another Tuesday with the oven. You take a flaky pie crust with a velvety potato filling that is usually topped off with whipped cream, but most older cooks preferred maple syrup as that was what they grew up with. Just a bit of dark brown sugar would elevate this dish into the perfect dessert, though it would often steal the show entirely on its own. The thing is built to make your mouth water, and we mean looks-wise too, since the brown and caramel hues of the pie just make it all the more enticing. Have you ever heard of this one before, and would you try it? Now, the French weren't fans of the rabbit pie, so they decided to whip up a pigeon pie instead. This delicacy dates all the way back to the 17th century when James Hart, a Scottish physician, wrote in 1633 that pigeon pies were usually served with far too much pepper. It became an instant hit after Hart's paper, and people started cutting down on the pepper a bit. This crispy dish was a savory game pie made of pigeon meat and various other ingredients traditional to French cuisine. The buttery crust made it a luxurious treat which was common on banquet tables. It was a tradition for wives to make pigeon pie after their husbands spent long days hunting for the delicious bird. But hey, homemade pickles. No self-respecting grandma would let a crop of cucumbers go to waste. Enter homemade pickles. Pickles aren't just a way to add zing to a sandwich. They are a way to maintain all of the garden's hard work. When the cucumbers roll up too fast for you to eat, you pickle them, and it's so easy. But pickles aren't just limited to cucumbers, carrots, onions, even nuts can be salted. Ready to be a delicious and crunchy side dish in almost any meal. Pickles have a fun history too. It dates back thousands of years to ancient Mesopotamia. But in Grandma's time, it was all about jars and secret salt recipes passed down from generation to generation. Some pickles are sweet, some types have a sour taste, and some packed a punch that would bring tears to your eyes. It is a science and an art, and Grandma has perfected the pickling process. The best part? Pickles will last forever. Okay? Maybe not forever, but it's close enough. If stored properly, it can be stored for months or even years, ready to add deliciousness to any meal. Navy bean soup, as the name implies, is one right out of the cookbooks of the military. See, all those soldiers get so awfully tired from traveling to other countries all of the time, they end up needing soups filled with ham and cured pork to put some pep in their step. Navy bean soup was particularly nice for two reasons. It was already cheap, which was kind of the theme of the time with the World Wars. But even after that, the habit of rationing and using cheap ingredients for military ventures didn't really go away. Anything that cuts costs, right? Navy bean soup definitely knew how to save money. And once slow cookers became a thing, it was saving time too. The second reason is that it was pretty easy to make wherever you were, and it was easy to carry around too, in pots or a thermos. This meant that it was the perfect military food. Healthy, easy to make in bulk, and easy to carry around. Don't think it takes a genius to figure out why they abused this recipe to the moon and back. Probably heard of one too many times, but never gotten enough of: meatloaf with mashed potatoes. Let's just say that comfort cooking really does not get much higher than this, nor more relaxing. Sitcoms, movies, and comedies across the decades that depict middle-class families always have somebody serving up a killer meatloaf, and it is for good reason. Our generation's parents always grew up eating a hearty meatloaf with a side of perfectly mushy soft potatoes, so it is no wonder that they kept the custom going. Today, mashed potatoes have an 85% popularity rate, which even beats hamburgers and cheeseburgers. You would think that those would be America's top one, but it seems nothing can beat Grand's meatloaf classics. The rise of Chinese hot pots, instant boiled mutton might just make a comeback. Corned beef and cabbage, a classic St. Patrick's Day dish, but did you know it was once a common comfort food? Known as salt beef in some Commonwealth countries, this American-Irish dish was a hearty protein source and a staple on the table during the 17th through the early 20th centuries. It was tinned along with sugar and spices during World War I and World War II when fresh meat was rationed. Cabbage brought in the right amount of nutrients, making this meal not just delicious, but also a healthy choice. While still popular in some circles, corned beef and cabbage aren't half as famous as it once was. But if you're ever up for some good old-fashioned cooking, there are recipes for this one all over the internet, and they're pretty easy to follow. And finally, we have stuffed lamb heart. This dish is another example of our ancestors' resourceful use of every part of an animal. This meaty meal also goes around with the unique nickname of love in disguise in many parts of England. While the origins are unclear, it first emerged in Kettner's Book of the Table in 1887 and took over Great Britain. The heart was cleaned, stuffed with breadcrumbs, herbs, and sometimes even minced meat, and then roasted or braised. This was a nutrient-rich meal which was a fulfilling delicacy after a long day of hard work. Canned vegetables were the silent workers of Granny's kitchen. Those beautiful inventions offered the hint of a summer in Granny's pantry, although it was buried in snow. Think for a moment that you entered her kitchen and saw those shiny jars standing as soldiers, always giving you the taste of comfort in your mouth. Canning the vegetables wasn't just about preserving the harvest. It was, to a certain extent, a survival technique in a world where a grocery store was not a day's ride away. For the green beans or the tomatoes, for instance, Grandma would always ensure that she picked the freshest from her farm and prepared them in the most appropriate way. If they are your favorite vegetables or fruits, it's like preserving them in time. If you close the lid well, you are going to be eating the produce of the summer, even in winter. Did you know that the art of canning dates back to the early 19th century? It was developed as a means through which people could acquire food during wartime. Boy, that operation was something like a military strategy. And now, we can enjoy that same convenience in our homes. Canned veggies are perfect for making soups, casseroles, and even as a side dish. No cooking required. Simply heat the meal and you're set to start your delicious eating spree. As a country, we can thank Texas for a lot of things. Tex-Mex cuisine, an infinite supply of memes thanks to country music, rodeos, some of the nicest BBQ sauces you'll ever have, and a guaranteed chuckle every time you have to speak to a redneck Republican. If you want to keep adding to the list, a good chili con carne is something that'll make you even more thankful the state exists and has developed into the savory jackpot it is. The dish pretty much means chili with meat, and it's a wonderful blend of beef, chilies, and spices with roots in the Mexican borderlands. It's somewhat become a symbol of Texas cooking too, which is known for not being easy on your stomach at all. This dish is no different because it takes cubed beef, chili peppers, and beans, plus some canned tomatoes, and puts them in a slow cooker. The one-pot way of cooking it was kind of considered a massive game changer because, while yes, you could just leave it to cook now, it meant that you didn't have to stir the chili constantly. The thing with chili con carne is that unless you did that stirring, you really wouldn't get the same bang for your buck. Inexpensive, popular in chili parlors, and very good with a cold beer, it doesn't take rocket science to figure out how this dish has all the elements it needs to succeed in middle-class Texas. As far as the chili craze goes, when America did go through phases of wanting spicier food, a lot of states besides Texas would go back to this southern classic. Some say this dish is also a Native American classic because if you go to the Southwest, you'll find remnants of old tribes, like the Pueblo, who still make variants of this dish. Theirs are even more traditional, with the recipes largely unchanged since pre-colonial European times. Chili con carne is a wonderful melting pot of indigenous, Mexican, and Spanish that takes full advantage of the different backgrounds that are present in American cooking. Pot roasts have been as much a part of the grand scheme of American culture and cuisine as anything else on this dish, and each area, state, and neighborhood has their own ideas of what one should look like. Were you the kind of kid that grew up on beef chuck roast, potatoes, a beefy broth, and carrots in your roast? Maybe you had boneless chuck roast, olive oil, bay leaves, and stuff like that instead. These are just the few variations you can expect to find when it comes to a good, well-done pot roast. The perfect party snack or a great one to pull out for an incredibly large family dinner with the in-laws and extended family, this is one dish that never fails to pull through, especially when a seasoned cook is behind it. Tastes change, and so do our feathered friends. Ever wondered what the ultimate American comfort food was back in the day? Well, the only right answer is the veal and ham pie. This hearty pie combined the delicate flavors of veal with the salty goodness of ham. The pie's popularity surged during the Victorian era. It originated in the kitchens of English settlers and was a practical choice for using up leftovers, but soon became a meal for the elite. While it was a luxurious delicacy in England, it was a staple in large households in America. Not only was it easy to whip up, but was also cheap to make, which made it perfect for communal gatherings and large families. Salted pork, also known as the original meat preservation recipe, is the true most valuable player of Grandma's kitchen. Before anyone stares in the refrigerator, people rely on salt to maintain the freshness of their meat, or at least keep it edible. Imagine a time when all that stood between you and rotting meat was a hearty layer of salt. Grandma knew this secret well. She took a good piece of pork and mixed it with salt, and voila! Salted pork was born. The exciting thing about this method is that the salt draws out moisture. This makes bacteria almost unable to grow. It's like having a tiny bouncer at your meat party, ensuring that no unwanted germs spoil the celebration. Salted pork could be thrown into a pot of beans, added to a hearty stew, or simply fried up for breakfast. The options are endless, and Grandma knew them all. In addition, salted pork is a staple food during difficult times. It supported the family when fresh meat was in short supply. As an added bonus, it's versatile and will last for months. Perfect for the long winter months or if you're traveling around the country. Although modern health trends warn against excessive sodium intake, in your grandmother's time, a pinch of salt was the only way to survive. So next time you're eating bacon or ham, think of your grandmother's salted pork heirloom. It is not just a relic from the past, but a delicious reminder of how creativity can lead to delicious solutions. On the other end of the spectrum, we have something brazenly American, with a lot of influences from spicy recipes popular in Mexican cooking. I was expecting something that would set you on fire like you were, but tamale pies are actually pretty neat in that regard. They're kind of like a build-your-own burger because you can adjust a lot of things about this to create your own tamale pie specific to your tastes. Basically, there's no universal standard, no golden rule of thumb you need to follow here. That's probably why it became such a well-loved middle-class dish, because it meant that people could easily tweak the recipe however they needed according to whatever was there in the pantry. Hey, sometimes it's the last of the month and you just don't have a lot of oomph going on in your pantry. Sometimes you get a slight bonus and you decide to get that better, premium cut of meat. Both times can be a tamale pie night if you're down. You couldn't say that before the slow cooker because it meant that you'd have to spend a lot of your day babysitting the dish, but now, the dish just makes itself really. If you want a tame introduction to Mexican food, tamale pies might be a good place to start, or if you just like tomato sauce-based pies with chili seasonings and cornmeal. Speaking of how different things were in their time due to the economical strife, one thing that got really popular back when your grandparents were still young was sausage gravy and biscuits. This might seem like an outlandish combo to us today, and we admit it takes a bit of getting used to, but the magic is all in the gravy. Biscuits and gravy are already something Americans have been pretty accustomed to eating, especially in the 20th century, but innovation is one of the finer points of the country, and culinary matters are no exception. People eventually found out that using pork sausage crumbles enriched the gravy and made it irresistible, especially if they were smoked. Usually, biscuits like jumbo buttermilk ones make for a great side to the dish, but even the gravy alone was worth eating on its own. Before chicken became everyone's favorite pie stuffing, rabbit pie was a favorite on the Easter table. Made out of tender rabbit meal, this savory pie was a household favorite in many rural areas. Rabbit meat is not only rich in flavor, but it's full of nutrients, which made this a healthy choice for many and a staple of the American pioneers. Plus, rabbit meat didn't cost a fortune like most meat back in the day and was widely available. Along with rabbit meat, ingredients of the filling of a rabbit pie typically included onions, celery, and carrots. Some English variations included prunes, bacon, and cider, while the Australians sometimes included the food paste Vegemite. Rabbits aren't as common as they were back then, so rabbit pie has vanished from our tables and Easter traditions. You know what? All good things come to an end. Dried beans may sound unattractive, but don't let its unassuming appearance fool you. They are the kings of the pantry. These little guys are the unsung heroes of Grandma's kitchen. And there's always a sack or two hidden somewhere in the back of the pantry. Cheap, nutritious, and can last for many years. Dried beans are truly a miracle food. In fact, in difficult times, they often form the backbone of many meals. You can't go wrong with a hearty bean soup or stew. When you want to feed a crowd without breaking the bank, let's face it, Grandma knows how to stretch out a meal. She can turn a pound of beans into a week's worth of dinners, and each nut tastes better than the last. Of course, there is also soak them at night all over it. That sounds tricky in today's fast-paced, microwave-ready world. But in Grandma's time, that was just part of life. You soak the beans and wait. And when they're ready, they're cooked slowly over low heat until they melt deliciously in your mouth. Dry beans also come in all shapes and sizes, such as kidney beans, pinto beans, black beans, etc. Grandma's pantry is basically a bean buffet. It has space for all kinds of soups, stews, and salads. So next time you're walking down the bean aisle, give a nod to these pantry powerhouses. Let's go on over to Creole cuisine. Want to know a hot spot for that kind of cooking back in the 1970s? It was shrimp Creole, which had hints of several other styles of cooking. You could have something with French, Spanish, and African influences all in one bite. That's a pretty vast variety of flavors, so let's break down what Shrimp Creole had out of all of that. You have your basics like bell peppers, onions, and celery, but it also had canned tomatoes for a no-fuss sauce that really soaked in all of the aromatics and gave the shrimp a pretty unique flair. You could make this dish for around $2.80 back then, because per lb of shrimp usually cost you around $1.50 or $2 back then. That's a pretty bare minimum price, but let's say you were cooking for a family of 4. You would have been good in like $10 or $15 maximum. The whole mix of onions, celery, and peppers was actually considered a trinity in Cajun and Creole cooking. Shrimp Creole also made a lot of use of thyme, parsley, okra, and garlic as well, so you could really mix and match and see what worked best for you. Not everyone liked the traditional versions of the dish, and I can't blame them because it's meant for people who grew up having a completely different palate than ours. All the same, this dish, which is traditionally served over rice, was considered one of the greatest hits of the cuisine. Cajun and Creole in general had found a pretty nice home for themselves in places like New Orleans and Louisiana. Restaurants like Antoine's and Tujag's in the 19th century were establishing a solid Creole cooking scene, and by the 20th century, cookbooks had already featured Shrimp Creole as a solid dish you could rely on whenever you needed more seafood in your diet. Collard greens and ham hocks have been a combo that has very faithfully stood the passing of time, and we think it is partly due to all the different takes on it that families keep coming up with. You hear cabbage and your heart does not exactly burst with excitement, but collard greens is another story. Pair it up with smoky ham hocks and you have yourself a meal on a budget like no other. A ham hock itself is a portion of bone with connective tissue and some meat that is covered in fat and skin, and the other name for these is pork knuckles. With some sweet onions, garlic, and chicken broth, this was a recipe that would give any other dish a run for its money, and it was great for your diet too. Gotta make sure your grandkids love it or hate it. There's no denying that haggis is a unique and iconic dish. So, what does this dish consist of, you may ask? Well, this Scottish dish is made from sheep's heart, liver, and lungs, mixed with oats and spices, and cooked in a sheep's stomach. Yes, you heard that right. Robert Burns' poem, Address to a Haggis of 1786, made this meal Scotland's very own national dish and a literary classic. It is traditionally served with turnips and potatoes. Grandma's pantry just wouldn't have been complete without those rows of vibrant jars packed with homemade fruit preserves. They weren't there just for decoration. These jars were the key to enjoying summer's sweetness long after the last fruit had fallen from the trees. Peaches, strawberries, raspberries. If it grew, Grandma probably preserved it. And for good reason. Back then, you didn't just stroll to the store in the dead of winter for fresh fruit. Nope. You made do with what was in the pantry. And if Grandma's preserves were on the shelf, you were in for a real treat. You could spread it on toast, bake it into pies, or drizzle it over some homemade ice cream. One of the coolest things about preserves is how long they last. When sealed properly, they can last for years. They're like little time capsules of summer, ready to be opened when February's gray days have you longing for a taste of July. No need for refrigeration. Just a spot on the pantry shelf until you're ready to dive in. So the next time you're craving some nostalgia, grab a jar of preserves and let Grandma's sweet touch transport you back to those sun-soaked, simpler days. Pork and sauerkraut are things that come right out of German-American communities. Put this in a pot and leave it to cook, and let the fragrance carry you right to the streets of Munich and Prague, where New Year's celebrations meant that everyone had an incredible amount of pork and sauerkraut available all the time. It's definitely a historical middle-class dish associated with the late 1900s, and the slow cooking meant that even really tough cuts of pork could become tender, soft, melt-in-your-mouth slices of pork that got anyone's appetite going. When people were exploring foods from other countries, Pennsylvania in particular took a big interest in German food. Maybe because it had its fair share of German-American communities, or maybe because it was just that good. But either way, if you wanted to take an express tour into what German eating felt like, you would go on over to the Midwest or Pennsylvania to try this. Beef stew is a nostalgic childhood dish nobody can go without. Fresh pearl onions and a broth made out of the beef stock were the tricks to an unbeatable stew that is sorely missed every time you eat one that is not your grandma's. The modern-day beef stew involves an entire list of 10 ingredients for better readability that feels more like an overdone broth mixed with a lot of toppings. But that is because beef stews have gone a bit out of fashion unless you are in the South. This is also because beef stews today are usually made with red wine as a base. But the hearty and vigor-filled ones of your childhood were all about keeping it simple with vegetables and a solid cut of beef. Homemade vinegar was the magical elixir lurking in Grandma's pantry, the secret ingredient for everything, from tangy pickles to household cleaning. For most people, vinegar is a simple ingredient that is placed on the table as a condiment. This fermented concoction was the functional kitchen multi-tool that could and would do it all. Making vinegar at home is kind of an experiment. Taking some kind of fruit juice, say apple or grape, adding sugar into it and letting Mother Nature do the rest of her magic. Grandma would use it in her pickling adventures, ensuring those cucumbers were brined to perfection, ready to become a crunchy side dish. Why spend your hard-earned money on store-bought when you have fresh homemade food in a jar? But vinegar wasn't just for the kitchen. Oh no! Grandma would use it to clean surfaces, remove stains, and even freshen the laundry. Just imagine the confusion when people realized that the sour-smelling liquid could also work wonders around the house. Besides, homemade vinegar is organically better than its commercial counterparts, packed with probiotics and beneficial bacteria. So, next time you reach for a bottle of vinegar, remember that Grandma wasn't just a kitchen magician. She was a pioneer of practical living, turning something as simple as fermented fruit juice into a pantry staple that helped her cook, clean, and preserve all in one fell swoop. Nothing else. Slumgullion was a kind of American goulash, which was usually considered something that was conceived as a result of the needs of the Depression era. That's because it didn't really have a set stack of ingredients you needed to get, but rather, it would just use whatever was on hand. Usually that was stuff like basic vegetables and maybe some seasonings, but in the one-pot era, most people's pantries typically had ground beef, pasta, tomatoes, mushrooms, and other kinds of great savory stuff. You know, the kind of ingredients you could throw into a pot and make one lovely goulash out of. This dish really is a lot more practical than it is useful. But when most people try to make the best use out of their food, they often end up sacrificing flavor. You don't have to worry about that here at all, because this dish has it all thanks to the slow cooking. It's a stew like no other, and it comes on a serious budget. A lot of the recipes from the times of our parents come from the Depression and from when America was recovering from it, but things like baked ziti is what they would whip up when they had a bit of money in their pocket. Some cooked ziti, ricotta cheese, eggs, and spaghetti sauce meant for an incredibly easy and amazing pasta. If you had the Parmesan to spare, you could also sprinkle it on or add a melted layer as a topping. It did not take too long to make, and it tasted very different from regular pasta or spaghetti and meatballs, which was a recipe favored by moms more than grandmas. The real highlight of the dish is in the shape of the ziti, since they end up being these 25 to 30 centimeter tubes. When they turn into soft pasta, they become great for chewing and work really well with the cheese. Grandmas would always spice it up with some beef or duck here and there, though. Mulligan stew is a dish that's often associated with lower-class cooking, and it was even something that homeless people relied on to get by the week. It can be best described as a makeshift meal, though if I were being fully real with you, it was just the best you could make out of whatever scraps you had. What I couldn't tell you is how nice this actually ended up being, and the invention of the slow cooker meant that it took a lot less time to make. You could make it with potatoes, vegetables, or even dumplings, and it has evolved from a meal that you'd usually associate with horrible times and poverty to a staple of home-cooked one-pot meals. Working and middle-class families often resort to this when they want to take care of everyone's appetite in one go, and man, it really works. Flaky buttermilk biscuits are all well and good if you buy them as a snack at your local mart, but you have not tried a buttermilk biscuit until you get a veteran baker to make these for you. Who better than family? And what family member is more skilled in baking than your trusty grandmother? Well, not all of them cook or bake, but the nation has more than its fair share of grandma's creamy buttermilk recipes floating around the internet and cookbooks from dozens of years ago. Practice always makes perfect, and most home chefs learned that the great secret of an impeccable buttermilk biscuit is to not overmix so that you avoid flat and tough biscuits. These were extremely common as snacks to give to children in the family during holidays and were the perfect pairing for a gift basket. Wraps up all the best Native American recipes we bet made you think, man, I wish I knew about them sooner. Comment which recipe you like the best below, and don't forget to like and subscribe.